Luke Arlo wasn't reckless. Everyone who knew him said the same thing. If Luke was going out into the woods, he was ready. He knew what he was doing. The man had been hunting in the Oregon wilderness since he was 12 years old, first with his father, later alone. By 42, he could track elk by a broken twig, tell the weather by how moss moved on the trees. He respected the forest. He didn't underestimate it. That's why, when he didn't return from Grayspine in October of 2017, no one could quite accept it as an accident. He'd told his younger brother Nate that he planned to head out for a 3-day solo hunt, nothing extreme. The trip had been planned for weeks, maybe longer. The idea was to park along a quiet service road inside the northwest boundary near Slate Ridge. From there, he'd hike in a few miles, set up a base camp, and track through the ravine just below Crooked Bluff. It was remote, but not completely inaccessible, an area he'd been to more than a dozen times. That stretch of forest wasn't on any tourist map. It was dense, old growth, easy to get turned around if you didn't know what you were doing. But Luke knew. That's what made what happened next so strange. When the third day passed and Luke didn't come back, Nate waited until nightfall, just in case there'd been a delay. But by the next morning, there was no call, no text, no sign. That's when he drove out. It took him nearly 4 hours to reach the trailhead, winding through remote service roads and up narrow switchbacks barely wide enough for a truck. The morning frost hadn't yet melted when he pulled up and saw Luke's pickup still parked in the same place he'd described. The windows were clear. The tires weren't slashed. There were no broken branches or signs of struggle nearby. Nothing had been touched. Inside the truck, Luke's paperwork was still tucked above the visor. A gas receipt from 3 days earlier was crumpled in the passenger seat. His gloves were on the dashboard. His cell phone was not in the truck, but that didn't surprise Nate. Luke never took his phone into the woods. He liked to disconnect, said it kept his mind sharp. But now, staring at the empty cab and the trail disappearing into shadow, Nate felt a knot start to form that didn't go away. He called the local sheriff's department just after 10 a.m. A few hours later, a ranger unit from the Grayspine district met him at the trailhead. They logged the vehicle, took statements, and began a preliminary sweep of the surrounding half-mile. No prints, no broken foliage, no signs of distress, just untouched wilderness. By nightfall, a formal missing persons report had been filed, and a search and rescue operation was launched at dawn the following day. Within 48 hours, the area was crawling with activity. Volunteers, dogs, drones, helicopters with thermal imaging. Luke was considered a high-probability find. He had experience, gear, and survival knowledge. His brother insisted Luke would never have gone off trail without reason. That narrowed the initial search grid to about 12 square miles surrounding the ravine and ridgeline. But the problem wasn't terrain, it was the silence. No one found anything, not a boot print, not a dropped glove, not a water bottle. Nothing to suggest he'd even entered the woods beyond where his tire tracks ended. The dogs picked up a faint scent at the mouth of the trail, but it vanished within minutes. A few of them became visibly distressed. One refused to continue deeper into the forest and had to be removed from the field entirely. That dog had been working search and rescue for 6 years without incident. Nate stayed for every day of the search. He watched as trained teams swept grid after grid. He helped clear brush. He made calls to Luke's old friends, trying to remember if he'd mentioned any alternate routes or side plans. No one had answers. Luke didn't leave a map. He didn't say anything strange in the weeks leading up to the trip. His finances were in order. He had no enemies, no health problems. There was no reason to think he wouldn't come back. By day 10, the official search began to scale down. Resources were limited, and the forest was too large to cover in its entirety without fresh leads. Investigators began considering alternative theories, that Luke had fallen into a crevice, or drowned, or been attacked by a cougar or bear and dragged off trail. But none of that explained the total lack of evidence. Even in predation scenarios, there's usually something: disturbed ground, blood, scattered clothing. Here, there was only the untouched trail and the undisturbed truck. When the last of the teams packed up, Nate stayed behind. For 2 days, he walked the trail alone, calling out his brother's name. He left notes in Ziploc bags pinned to trees. Then he too left, with fewer answers than he came with. Luke Arlo had gone into a familiar forest, under clear skies, in good health and good spirits, and he never came back out. No signs of struggle, no weather events, no distress call, no gear recovered, just an empty truck parked at the edge of 230,000 acres, and a silence so complete it felt staged. Years would pass, the trail would fade beneath new brush. But for the rangers who'd walked that forest during those early days, one thing never sat right. It wasn't just that Luke was gone, it was that he had vanished without leaving even a question behind. In the first week, they believed they would find him. Missing hunters were uncommon in Gracebine, but not unheard of. The forest was massive, dense enough in parts to swallow sound. It wasn't impossible for someone to go off trail and get turned around, but that's what search and rescue was for. The system was built for people like Luke, people who were supposed to make it home. The operation expanded quickly. By day 3, there were over 40 people on the ground, including search and rescue volunteers, forest rangers, deputies, and canine teams brought in from neighboring counties. They started at the last confirmed point, Luke's truck, and moved outward in layered grids. The trail itself was narrow, overgrown with alder and cedar. It branched into at least 3 known game trails that fed into denser, less mapped terrain. The dogs were first. Trained to detect human scent, they were given Luke's unwashed shirt from his truck cab. One dog picked up a trail briefly, nose low, tail steady, before it stopped abruptly, not even 200 yards in. Another dog reacted the same way. Then, nothing. No scent trail, no bark alerts, just confusion. One of the handlers radioed in that the dog seemed disoriented, circling in place before sitting down. That was rare. It usually meant the trail had either gone cold fast or that the human was never there to begin with. The forest was still. No signs of passage, no broken twigs. No footprints in the soft loam. Helicopters with infrared began flying sweeps by day 4. Gracebine's foliage made ground scans difficult, especially under heavy canopy. Still, thermal spots popped, warm readings that suggested movement. One blip looked promising near Slate Ridge. Teams scrambled in. They found a black bear, fresh kill beside it. Another anomaly revealed nothing but a dense pile of leaves warming in the sun. Every potential lead unraveled. Meanwhile, interviews with Luke's family and friends painted a picture that only deepened the mystery. Luke didn't drink. He didn't use drugs. He had no known medical conditions. No history of depression or erratic behavior. He was close with his brother, spoke to his mother weekly, had plans to meet friends for a fishing trip the following month. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't chasing anything either. He was, by every account, solid. Prepared, the kind of man who packed his gear days in advance, double-checked trail maps and logged his planned coordinates in a notebook Nate later found on his nightstand at home. The coordinates matched exactly where his truck had been found. That meant he'd parked where he said he would, and from that moment on, he was gone. Deputies floated theories. Maybe he got turned around, slipped into a ravine, hit his head. Maybe he was caught in an old animal trap or fell into a sinkhole. Maybe he encountered a mountain lion. But none of these explained the lack of blood, gear, or signs of struggle. Rangers noted that even injured men crawl, bleed, or leave behind something. But Luke had left nothing, not a wrapper, not a broken branch. The weather was unseasonably mild that week. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, no storms, no flash floods, no natural event that could have buried a man and left no trace. They brought in heat-sensing drones, expanding the grid to over 15 square miles. Multiple anomalies appeared on day 6, once again, all false positives. A ranger from Deschutes County said, "It's like the forest's trying to confuse us." No one laughed. By day 10, the command post began to quiet. The media moved on. The daily updates slowed. Nate stayed, sleeping in a tent near the trailhead, refusing to leave even when told the official search would scale down. He started knocking on doors in nearby towns, asking hunters if they'd seen anything. A few told him not to look too hard, that Gracebine had its own rules. A retired trapper in Rosebridge said something strange, that the forest gives back what it wants to. No one followed up, At an internal debriefing at the end of week 3, the lead ranger stood in front of a map littered with pushpins and stared in silence. Then he said, "It's like he was swallowed whole." There was no formal conclusion, no evidence of crime, foul play, or accident. The case was placed in long-term missing status. Active search operations ceased. Nate didn't. He returned monthly. He organized his own search parties. He went back to the same ridgeline again and again. He set up trail cams. He marked trees with orange tape, hoping for movement, signs, anything. But the forest gave nothing. No closure, no bones, no answers. Just the same question that had started it all. How could someone like Luke Arlo, with decades of experience and every intention to return, vanish without so much as a broken twig behind him? The forest stayed quiet. And so did the truth. The official search ended, but the story didn't. In the months that followed Luke Arlo's disappearance, something shifted in the way people spoke about Grayspine. At first, it was small things, an odd pause when someone mentioned the North Trail, or the way rangers avoided assigning new recruits to the sector beyond Slate Ridge. But as winter passed and spring crept in, stories started to surface. Stories that made no sense on paper, but kept repeating in quiet tones around coffee counters and supply depots. Local hikers reported something they couldn't quite name. One woman said the air turned heavy when she crossed a certain ridge, like stepping into a space that didn't want her there. Another group, 3 men who'd camped for 2 nights near Crooked Bluff, swore their satellite radio picked up bursts of static every night at the same hour. The sound wasn't loud, but sharp, like a whisper dragging across a speaker. They chalked it up to faulty equipment until they got home and tested it again. Nothing. It only malfunctioned in Grayspine. A few tried setting up motion-triggered trail cameras. One man, a wildlife photographer named Devin West, placed 6 cameras near the area where Luke's scent trail had ended. The cameras were high-quality, weatherproof, designed to detect even the smallest movements. He left them for 10 days. When he retrieved the memory cards, 4 of them were completely blank, not corrupted, just empty, as if nothing had moved, not a squirrel, not a leaf. The forest, according to the footage, had been still. He said the footage felt wrong, and deleted it the same night. In late spring, a veteran hunter, someone who'd known Luke for years, came forward with a story that made no sense, even to him. He was scouting a ridge before turkey season when he saw a man watching him from the trees. The man was wearing full camouflage, unmoving, silent. At first, the hunter thought it was another tracker. He waved. No response. The man stepped back into the brush without a sound. When the hunter went to look, no prints, no snapped branches, just trees. He didn't report it to law enforcement. He wasn't even sure what he'd seen. But he told Nate. And Nate was ready to believe anything. Over the next few months, Luke's family did what many families do when official channels dry up. They turned to unofficial ones, online forums, paranormal podcasts, private investigators, eventually psychics. One woman came recommended by a friend of a friend, a remote viewer from Idaho who claimed she'd found missing persons before. Nate was skeptical, but also desperate. She didn't ask for payment. She only wanted a copy of Luke's last known location and a personal item. She was mailed a copy of the topo map, a photo of Luke, and the receipt found in his truck. 3 weeks passed with no word. Then, a letter arrived. Inside was a hand-drawn map, crude and uneven, but oddly detailed. The woman had circled a place and written, "He's not buried, he's waiting." That's all it said. The map was strange for another reason. When compared to ranger trail charts, the marked area overlapped a zone unofficially known as Dead Thicket. It wasn't labeled on any public maps. Internally, the name came from a decades-old incident, a cluster of injured hikers who'd emerged disoriented, one requiring psychiatric care after claiming they'd lost time. Since then, the area was rarely patrolled. The thicket was dense, hard to navigate, full of thorned underbrush and false clearings. More than one ranger had come out of it bloodied, with gear damaged or compass readings that didn't match GPS logs. None of this was officially documented. But when Nate brought the psychic's map to the district office, the response was cold, dismissive. They told him they didn't follow paranormal leads and that Grayspine was a wild, untamed place. People got scared, equipment failed, rumors spread. But Nate knew the look the ranger gave when he saw the circle. Recognition. By summer's end, Nate had visited the marked area himself, alone. He followed animal trails, crossed dry creek beds, marked his way with biodegradable tape. He didn't find anything, but he also didn't feel alone. He said there were moments where the forest felt off rhythm, like it breathed differently. He couldn't explain it, just that it didn't feel like any place he'd ever walked, and he'd hunted half the state. He started keeping a notebook, logging oddities, radio interference, unusual bird patterns, moments where the wind shifted without warning. He even installed a small trail cam of his own, borrowed from a friend. It caught 2 deer. Then, nothing. Then, a 5-minute clip where the entire forest frame slowly went dark, not black, just increasingly dim, as if the light was being pulled away. There was no technical fault. The footage resumed at full brightness in the next frame. He didn't show it to anyone for months. By then, Luke had been gone for nearly a year. There were no further leads, no sightings, but those closest to the case, the ones who walked the forest, who watched the cameras, who heard the static, they all agreed on one thing. Something about that part of Grayspine felt wrong. Not cursed, not haunted, just watched. And whatever had taken Luke, it hadn't left footprints, but people were starting to feel its presence anyway. It wasn't a widely shared map. Nate never posted it online, never mentioned it in public forums. But like most things passed hand to hand, it didn't stay private forever. Someone talked. Someone made a copy. By the fall of 2019, the crude sketch made by the Idaho psychic, the one with the circled waiting zone deep inside Grayspine, started circulating in the fringe hiking and survivalist community. Most dismissed it, but 2 men didn't. They were known online only by their usernames, Ridgewalker and Pine Knots. Both in their mid-30s, self-styled survival experts with modest YouTube followings, mostly gear reviews and bushcraft tutorials. They weren't frauds, but they weren't seasoned wilderness trackers either. And when they posted a vague teaser about mapping a cursed zone in the PNW, few took it seriously. But local ranger logs would later confirm that both men signed into the Grayspine North entrance on October 16, 2019. No specific trail named, no return date noted. When they didn't exit within 48 hours, no alarms were raised. They were adults, equipped, and had not filed for a backcountry permit, which meant there was no formal expectation of return. It wasn't until day 4 that a nearby camper found a weather-damaged pack snagged in a drainage culvert nearly a mile from the nearest trail. Inside were 2 cracked walkie-talkies, a partially smashed GoPro, and a laminated copy of the psychic's map with additional marks drawn in red pen. One circle had been added around a ridgeline labeled Slope Edge with a question scrawled beneath it. It moved. That's when the search began. A sweep of the surrounding mile turned up no sign of the men, no campsite, no equipment. Aerial support was limited due to early snow. Still, rangers coordinated with deputies and forest staff to scour likely paths. On the morning of day 5, one of the men, Ridgewalker, later identified as Noah Reed, stumbled barefoot out of the tree line and collapsed near the road. He was severely dehydrated, partially hypothermic, and muttering incoherently. His arms were scratched raw. His shoes and pack were never recovered. He was airlifted to St. Helens Regional Medical. For almost 24 hours, he didn't say a word. When he finally did speak, it was only once, to a nurse changing his IV. According to the report, he whispered, "It's still in the trees. Don't follow the light." His friend was found later that evening, crouched beside a creek 2 miles east, clutching a small carved stick and humming a low, repeating note. He was covered in old mud, his eyes unfocused. When questioned, he refused to speak at all. To this day, he hasn't commented publicly. The official report from the Grayspine Ranger District blamed disorientation, dehydration, and early onset exposure symptoms. They cited psychological breakdown under duress, noting the terrain was not appropriate for untrained off-trail exploration. The GoPro was water damaged beyond repair, no usable footage recovered. No criminal charges were filed. The case was quietly closed, but internally it triggered something else. In a closed-door meeting held 2 weeks later, the head ranger of Grayspine, a 22-year veteran named Diana McCleary, convened a review board with 3 senior field staff, 1 regional supervisor, and a Forest Service's risk analyst. The meeting minutes were never released, but 2 staff who later left the department confirmed that a recommendation was made to reclassify a 3-square-mile zone within Grayspine as inactive. The term used publicly was unstable terrain, landslide risk, erosion, old fire damage, the usual language that allowed quiet closures without panic. Trail maintenance ceased, signs were removed. The area was no longer assigned for patrol or campsite surveys. Internally, though, it earned a different name: the Loop. It started as a nickname between rangers, a joke at first, but not a funny one, because those who'd spent time in the area began to speak of the same sensation: direction going strange, compass needles jittering, GPS systems recalibrating mid-hike. One ranger walked the same half-mile loop 4 times without realizing he'd circled. Another swore the sun shifted westward early. One simply said, "Time bends out there." They weren't theories shared with the public, but staff rotated out quicker. Fewer rookies volunteered for Grayspine posts. Patrol logs became shorter, more cautious. Radios were double-checked before shifts. Trail cameras placed near the perimeter of the new inactive zone rarely returned full batteries, and when they did, the SD cards showed blank footage or brief clips of fog rolling through where there had been none forecasted. Nate heard about the survivalists eventually. He tried to speak with them both. The one who talked refused to meet. The one who didn't talk wouldn't take messages. But someone mailed him the broken GoPro. No note, no return address, just the camera in a padded envelope. It didn't work, not even after multiple attempts to extract files from the memory card. But the casing had something strange on it, a smear of something black, sticky, dried between the lens and the edge of the grip. Forensics couldn't confirm what it was. Not blood, not sap, not ash, just residue, like something had touched it and then left. The story never made the news. No press coverage, no official warnings, just another entry in an internal log tucked between forms and acronyms. But inside the ranger station, maps were redrawn. Notes were added, and the phrase, "Don't follow the map," started appearing in ballpoint ink beside hand-sketched boundaries. It was no longer just a rumor. The loop was real. And something inside it watched the ones who came looking. The fire started small, a lightning strike during an early May storm that passed over Grayspine's western ridges with barely a sound. No thunder, no visible burn at first. But by the time aerial scans picked up the heat signature, it had already crept across 20 acres of brittle undergrowth, feeding on years of dry pine needles and wind-dried ferns. Wildfires weren't uncommon in that part of Oregon. What made this one different was where it moved, right along the northern edge of the area rangers had quietly labeled the Loop. By week's end, multiple units had been called in, not because the fire was especially large, but because of its direction. It was heading toward the inactive zone, a section of forest no one patrolled anymore, where no one camped, where the trees grew too close and signals stopped working. One crew, based out of Marion County, was assigned to cut a containment line across a high slope above the loop's edge. Midway through the line dig, one firefighter struck something hard in the dirt. At first, they thought it was a buried post, maybe an old survey marker. But as they scraped away the topsoil, more metal emerged. The barrel of a rifle, angled upward at a strange tilt, rusted nearly through but intact enough to show a partial serial number. A supervisor flagged it. The fire line was paused. A ranger on site, a man who'd worked Grayspine back in 2017, stepped in to examine it. He made one call, then another. Within hours, the rifle was tentatively matched to Luke Arlo, the missing hunter who had vanished 7 years earlier, without a trace. The crews were pulled back. Fire lines were redirected. A forensic team was dispatched with orders to examine the surrounding area as carefully as possible without interfering with fire control efforts. The initial scans showed signs of disturbed soil, root collapse, and something deeper, a hollow pocket beneath a fallen tree, half covered in ash and decades of rot. It didn't look like a grave. It looked like someone had lived there. What they found wasn't a campsite. It wasn't a debris shelter thrown together in desperation. It was something else, deliberate, hidden, planned. The mouth of the cavity began under the gnarled root system of an old Douglas fir that had fallen years ago. Its base hollowed out naturally by rot, but someone had reinforced it with stone and broken branches, covering it with a blend of moss and brush that blended perfectly with the surrounding earth. Inside, the space widened into a dome-like crawl chamber, no more than 4 feet tall, 10 feet across, just enough for a man to sit, sleep, and wait. Inside were scraps of fabric, a melted flashlight casing, a tarnished fork, and further in, a tarp pulled over what remained of a sleeping roll, now half consumed by mildew. But the most chilling find was at the far end of the chamber, a short carved totem wedged upright in the soil, human-shaped. Mouth open, no eyes. It hadn't been placed for decoration. It looked like a warning. The recovery team wore gloves, masks. Every item was logged and tagged. When they removed the sleeping roll, they found the first set of remains. Partial, mostly bone, no tissue left. Dental records later confirmed it. Luke Arlo. His body had been there for years, undisturbed, sheltered, but he didn't die immediately. That became clear from what was found next. Hidden in the dirt beneath a corner of tarp, just behind a rusted pan, was a spiral-bound notebook. Pages warped but legible in parts. The entries were dated. The first was from November 2017, weeks after Luke disappeared. The last was mid-2019. He had survived at least that long. The entries were brief, block letters, no flowery descriptions or emotional rambling, just facts. Food tracked, weather recorded, sounds noted, mentions of movement outside the shelter. The phrase, "it circled again," appears multiple times. Later, mimicry confirmed and voices don't match. One entry, underlined 3 times, reads, "Do not respond. It learns your tone." But it wasn't the only thing found. As the forensic team expanded the excavation, they discovered a second pocket chamber connected to the first by a narrow tunnel. Inside were more bones, smaller, undocumented. No dental records matched. Forensics would later estimate the remains belonged to a juvenile male, age range 10 to 13. No identification, no missing persons reports in the region from that time frame. But based on decomposition, the child had died at least 25 years earlier. Both bodies were found in close proximity, as if they had once shared the space. Theories flooded in. Had Luke found the child's remains and buried them near his shelter? Or had someone, something, placed the boy there later? Had Luke been alone, or was he not the first? None of those questions were answered at the site, but what chilled responders most wasn't the bones, it was the silence, the unnatural stillness inside the cavity. Radios lost signal, batteries drained faster than expected. One veteran recovery worker later said, "It felt like the earth was holding its breath." The fire line was completed the next day. The blaze was contained, but the shelter, the lair, remained in focus. The fire had uncovered it, but something else had kept it hidden all that time. For 7 years, Luke Arlo had been listed as a missing person. For at least 2 of those, he was alive, sheltered beneath the roots of an old tree, less than 2 miles from where search teams had passed again and again. He hadn't run. He hadn't wandered. He had gone to ground. And now, after 7 years of silence, the forest had finally given him back. The shelter had been hidden with a kind of desperation that didn't come from panic, but purpose. Every root is packed with soil. Every stone is fitted to obscure. Whoever had built it, and the journals made clear it was Luke, hadn't wanted to be found. Not by people, not by whatever he believed was hunting him. And what was left behind made that fear unmistakably real. Forensics confirmed the larger remains belonged to Luke Arlo within days. His dental records matched. So did fragments of an old surgical pin in his left knee from a climbing accident years prior. But that only explained half of what was inside the earth-packed chamber. Because a second skeleton was found pressed into the opposite wall, smaller, collapsed inward, bones warped by time and pressure. This body had been there longer. That much was clear. The joints hadn't fused the same way. Dental estimates placed the age somewhere between 10 and 13. The pelvis was too degraded to confirm gender. There was no clothing left, no identifiable belongings, just fragments of a blanket and a small set of finger bones curled toward the spine like the child had died mid-turn. There were no matching missing child reports from the last 2 decades. Not in Oregon, not in the surrounding counties, nothing in federal databases either. And the shelter, with its sealed chambers and layered exits, suggested that whoever the child had been, they hadn't wandered in by accident. They had either been brought there, or they had been waiting. Next to Luke's body, tucked into a waterproof pouch made from overlapping plastic and bark, were 4 small notebooks, hand-sized. The covers were warped, but inside the writing was almost intact, pages of thick block-lettered entries with no dates beyond the year, just observations marked with dashes or simple symbols. Rangers read in silence as each line pulled them deeper into what Luke had lived. The earliest entries are methodical: temperature readings, sunlight duration, wildlife sightings, mentions of water sources and preserved food counts. Luke had survived, not just in body but in mind, for a time. He writes of tracking patterns, of marking safe paths, of learning when to stay hidden. But slowly, the entries change. He starts referring to the boy, not in the past tense, in the present, sometimes near, sometimes gone. No name, just glimpses. The boy sat in the hollow for hours today, didn't speak, just watched the trees. Another entry reads, he came back, didn't remember leaving, had new scratches, won't talk about them. There's no sign of delusion in these early mentions, just documentation. A man trying to make sense of something he doesn't understand. Then, the entries start including drawings, rough shapes repeated again and again, circles with broken edges, trees with no tops, a mouth always open, sometimes alone, sometimes mirrored. Then comes the word watchers. At first, it's unclear if he's referring to animals. Luke had always believed predators watch their prey for days before striking, but his tone shifts. One page, written in unbroken lines, reads, "They don't blink. They stand in the trees too long, too still. Their shoulders are wrong. They make no noise. They wait until you speak." He mentions mimicry, that it starts small, leaves rustling wrong, a voice that almost sounds like his brother, then like the boy, then like himself. He stops using names in the journals entirely. Later entries only use it or them. Forensic psychologists were brought in. One suggested the writings pointed to progressive isolation trauma, a breakdown of cognitive function caused by stress, starvation, fear. Another argued that the clarity of the entries undercut that diagnosis. The handwriting never becomes erratic. The spacing remains precise. He wasn't unraveling. He was recording. Then there's the phrase, "the loop that resets." It appears a dozen times across the final notebook, sometimes in the margins, sometimes as standalone lines. The loop reset again, boy gone, came back different, or it knows I'm watching the loop now. And finally, in larger, bolder lettering, one page that reads, "It needs us to witness the reset. That's how it stays." Interpretations vary. Some believe Luke was describing a natural phenomenon, weather patterns, animal migrations, even his own hallucinated routines. Others believe he was describing a structure or pattern of behavior from something he couldn't identify. The concept of a loop, not of time but of behavior, comes up repeatedly in wilderness folklore. Animals retracing steps. People are drawn to places they've never been. Theories piled up, but none explained the last page. There, in ink darker than the rest, the handwriting pressed harder, is one final sentence. "If you find this, burn it all." It's not signed. It doesn't need to be. Rangers did not burn the shelter. The protocol required full documentation, every item bagged and tagged, every notebook photographed, copied, and stored. But the man who carried Luke's remains out of the forest that day, a quiet ranger named Thomas Guerrero, later admitted he kept the totem. It hadn't been logged officially. It wasn't part of the chain of evidence. It sat wedged into a wall niche near the sleeping area, carved from dark, unknown wood, human-like, but not quite. Its face stretched longer than natural, no eyes, just a smooth, flat space, and below it, a wide, open mouth. He said he didn't know why he took it, just that he didn't want it left behind. He never brought it home, just locked it in a storage box behind the ranger station. A week later, he quit without notice. None of the team went back into the loop, not after what they read, not after what they carried out. They almost missed the recorder. It was wedged between the collapsed roots and the back wall of the second chamber, half buried under a flat stone and wrapped in layers of cloth hardened by age. The plastic casing had cracked clean through, and the buttons were stuck from moisture. It looked like junk. Old tech, not part of Luke's usual gear. And yet, someone had taken the time to protect it. That alone was enough to flag it for priority forensic recovery. At the regional lab, it took nearly 4 days to carefully extract and clone the internal memory. Several files were corrupted beyond repair, but 2 small audio segments survived. One was just under 40 seconds, the other 2 minutes and 6 seconds. Both had no date metadata attached. Time and location tags had either never been recorded or had degraded beyond recovery. But the voice on the first recording was unmistakable. It was Luke. He sounds strained. The audio clicks with interference, like he's recording too close to the microphone or in a place where signal warps. There's wind, low and inconsistent. Then his voice comes through, hoarse and clipped. It's back. It waited this time. It waits longer now. Same place, same feeling. The boy's still not right. Then static. And then, you're not done. You're not done. You're not done. The voice changes. It's not Luke anymore. At first it's subtle. The tone is almost identical. The cadence eerily close. But the last 2 repetitions fall flat at the end, like the speaker is guessing where the emphasis should be. Forensics confirmed it wasn't a copy-paste audio loop. Each phrase was spoken separately, with minute variations in pitch and pressure, like something was trying to replicate speech by ear. The second audio file is quieter. No speaking at first, just what sounds like shallow breathing, a few shifting sounds of weight on dirt and the distant crack of underbrush. Then, far back in the audio space, so faint it had to be isolated to be heard, the same phrase again. You're not done. This time, slower. And this time, Luke doesn't respond. The recordings were sent to a university research group specializing in environmental acoustics. Their analysis came back inconclusive. There were no clear audio anomalies, no overlapping frequency artifacts, no synthetic sound waves, no signs of editing. The mimicry appeared natural. That was the part that disturbed the Rangers the most. A mimic shouldn't sound that human. The lead analyst noted that in some deep wilderness environments, natural echoes, wildlife sounds, and wind distortion can create the illusion of human speech. He offered that the voice could have been a reflection of Luke's own, a natural auditory hallucination under stress. But when pressed, he admitted something else. The whispered voice was recorded at a different pitch and distance than Luke's, with no matching mouth sounds or breath patterns. It wasn't an echo, and it wasn't his. Back in Grayspine, ranger teams reviewed Luke's final journal again. Toward the back cover, carved into the stiff backing, were 12 hash marks, scratched in clean single strokes. Every 7th mark was drawn heavier. The 12th mark had a circle around it. The final entry beside it read, 7 resets, 7 years, I will try again. The phrase wasn't explained, but it wasn't random. A ranger named Emmett Dahl, who had worked the area for over 2 decades, began to sort through old missing persons records out of curiosity. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He just wanted to see if there were other cold cases like Luke's, and what he found stopped him cold. Every 7 years, give or take a few weeks, someone had disappeared inside a specific 5-mile radius of Grayspine. A solo camper in 1989, a mushroom forager in 1996, a teenager on a dare in 2003, a retired biology professor in 2010, and then Luke in 2017. 5 disappearances, same radius, similar conditions, no recoveries, no remains, no clear cause. Now it is 2024, 7 years since Luke, and barely 2 months until the same week. Emmett brought his findings to the regional office. At first, the higher-ups dismissed it. coincidence, statistical artifact. But the pattern was there, drawn plainly in case reports and patrol logs. Same time of year, same boundaries, no shared demographics, no criminal ties. But Luke's final entries added weight. He wrote of being seen but not found, that it watches when the light moves differently, that the boy only appeared near the resets, that the forest loops itself around the ones it wants. He made no mention of time travel, no mysticism, just repetition, patterns. Loop theory, as rangers began to refer to it internally, didn't mean time restarted, it meant behavior restarted. That something in that part of Gracebine followed a rhythm, a hunt or a test or a replication cycle. Luke believed it studied its subjects, took something from them, then returned for more. Rangers began making quiet plans, discreet patrol adjustments, a moratorium on solo scouting, no public announcements, no formal reports. But gear checks were doubled, radios tested every morning, and a small camera trap was installed 2 miles from the shelter, facing one of the older trees near the loop's inner boundary. On its first night, the battery drained in under 3 hours. No footage was recovered. They replaced the battery and tried again. This time, it lasted until morning, but the lens had fogged from inside. No environmental cause, no leaks in the casing. A third attempt yielded 5 seconds of video, just enough to show a shape standing too far to identify, just within the tree line. The timestamp matched 3:11 a.m., the same time the mimic's voice had spoken on the audio tape. "You're not done." It wasn't a threat. It sounded almost like a reminder. The team didn't sleep that night, and they began counting the weeks. 7 years had passed, and whatever lived in the loop, it was about to start again. The name hadn't come up in years. Emmett Halpern, retired now, but once the longest-serving ranger in the Gracebine district, 27 years in the field, most of them uneventful. He'd quietly left the service in 1995. No ceremony, no incident, just stepped away after what he called too many things that didn't belong in reports. He'd kept to himself since then, living just outside Oak Ridge in a small cabin at the edge of state land. No internet, no cell phone. Most of the younger staff had never heard of him, but when the second skeleton was confirmed to be a juvenile, no older than 13, male, and estimated to have died in the late 1980s, Emmett called the station himself. He didn't start with pleasantries. His voice on the line was flat, measured. He just asked, "Did the boy have a carved figure with him?" When told yes, and that it matched a totem found near Luke Arlo's remains, Emmett went quiet for nearly a minute. Then he said, "You need to hear what I never filed. The record from 1989 is thin. What exists now is pieced together from Emmett's recollection and scraps from the archived dispatch logs. A boy had gone missing, 10 years old, name not released publicly at the time, listed only in a coded case file, now marked inactive. He'd been camping with extended family somewhere near the western edge of Gracebine. Late August. Clear weather. According to the family, he went into the woods after dinner to relieve himself and never came back. The search lasted 2 weeks. Emmett was the lead field ranger. Over 60 people combed the forest. Helicopters flew low grids. Dogs were brought in. There were no signs, no scent trails, no disturbed brush. It mirrored Luke's disappearance almost exactly. And then, on the 14th day, the boy returned. He was found by a volunteer team, standing near the road, barefoot, shirt torn, no visible injuries. His expression was blank. Not afraid, not relieved, just vacant. When asked where he'd been, he said he didn't know. When asked who he'd been with, he only said, "A quiet man." He couldn't describe him. I couldn't remember what he looked like. When pressed further, he cried and refused to speak. Emmett said the boy was medically stable but severely dehydrated and emotionally withdrawn. A small carved figure was found in his pocket. The shape was human-like, with a rounded top and slashes across the center. No eyes, no facial features, just a mouth, open. The same pattern as the one later recovered from Luke's shelter. Emmett recognized it the moment the photo was circulated. Back then, no one knew what to make of it. The totem was dismissed as a trinket, maybe something from home. But Emmett kept thinking about how the boy had said, "a quiet man," and how he was found within 3 miles of where Luke's rifle had surfaced decades later. The final report for the 1989 case was never completed. Emmett says it wasn't deliberate. He wrote it, signed it, filed it. But years later, when he went looking for the file out of curiosity, it was gone. Nothing in the system, no paper copy in archives. Just a dispatch record of the initial call and the closing status. Subject recovered, alive. That was all. Now, with the second skeleton dated to the same era and an identical totem in hand, Emmett was certain of what he'd long suspected but never said aloud. The boy had returned, but not alone. Something had followed, or something had allowed him to leave for a reason. He didn't believe Luke killed the boy, quite the opposite. Emmett believed Luke had found him, maybe even protected him. He imagined Luke stumbling upon that shelter, finding a feral child inside, living alone, barely surviving. Maybe they lived there together for a time. Maybe they waited for help that never came. And then, Emmett said, maybe it came back. He didn't give it a name, said it didn't deserve one. The idea horrified some, that a boy had survived for weeks or months out there, been recovered, then ended up back in the same stretch of forest years later. That Luke had been part of a cycle neither of them understood. A loop, as Luke had called it, resetting, repeating. The forensic timeline didn't rule it out. The boy's bones showed signs of long-term malnutrition, healed fractures, and stress markers consistent with prolonged shelter life. No signs of trauma at death, just collapse, quiet. If Luke had taken him in, buried him, or laid him to rest, it had been done with care. No shallow grave, no disposal, just placement, like someone who didn't know what else to do. What lingered wasn't just the remains. It was the knowledge that someone had returned, that someone had made it back across whatever threshold Luke never could. The idea shattered the neat closure of the earlier theory that Luke had died alone, delusional, lost. Instead, he may have been the only thing keeping the cycle from closing. Emmett visited the ranger station in person a week after the call. He brought a manila folder, old maps, handwritten patrol logs, and one photograph. It was blurry. A nighttime trail cam photo from 1991, taken near the same sector now labeled the Loop. In the background, beyond the blur of trees, was a shape, tall, featureless, mid-step. No arms, no face, just long, lean limbs and a head tilted slightly as if listening. Emmett said it only showed up once. The next frame was blank. The camera battery died minutes later. He never told anyone. Before leaving, he said one final thing. Whatever kept him alive wasn't mercy. It was time. And time, Emmett warned, always comes back around. The pages had started to fade by the end. Luke's handwriting, once sharp and blocky, had grown lighter, more erratic. The margins are filled with slashes and unfinished thoughts. Some words were missing vowels. Others were written twice, one on top of the other, as if he'd forgotten he'd already written them. But one sentence, near the last page of the final journal, was still clear, pressed hard enough into the paper that it left faint indentations beneath the ink. If it resets, tell them not to follow. It mimics hope. That's how it traps you. That entry was dated only with a year, 2019. No one could say for sure how much longer Luke had survived after writing it, but judging by the condition of his body and the presence of mold on the inner shelter walls, most experts agreed he likely died that same year. Not from trauma, not from exposure, just from exhaustion or surrender. The kind that happens slowly, without resistance, after enough time waiting for something that never comes. But the warning he left behind was clear. And it wasn't written like a plea. It reads like a rule. A message passed from someone who had spent years studying something he couldn't explain, who had come to understand, too late, what it wanted. He never used the word creature, never say thing. He never gave it a name. Only referred to it in terms of behavior, watchers, mimicry, resets. He avoided metaphor, avoided fantasy. That's what unnerved the team the most. This wasn't the rambling of a man who'd lost his grip. These were field notes, cold, measured, clinical. Like he'd been documenting an experiment that eventually turned inward. Rangers debated what to do with the site. Some wanted to keep it intact for further study. But Emmett Halpern, who'd seen the same loop once before and ignored it, was the one who made the decision. He called for it to be burned. No media was alerted, no press release issued. The public wasn't told that anything had been found at all. Officially, the wildfire had uncovered debris from an old poacher's camp. The name Luke Arlo remained on a long, quiet list of recovered subjects. No foul play. On the morning of the burn, a controlled perimeter was set. Accelerants were placed inside the hollow of the root shelter, alongside the remaining fragments of tarp, bedding, and gear. The journals were copied and secured. The totems, Luke's the boys, were placed in a fire-safe container for later study. Or so the team believed. The fire took place quickly. The dry root system crackled, collapsed inward, and within minutes the entire cavity caved in, releasing a deep, muffled thud as the air compressed beneath the flames. Smoke rose fast. Too fast, some thought, like the air inside had been waiting for release. The ash settled by noon. Most of the crew left after the perimeter was cleared, but one ranger stayed behind to sift through the cooled center, just to be sure. That's when he found it. A totem, still warm, but not burned, not old, carved from wood that hadn't been there before. New cuts, sharp edges, no soot along the grooves. The figure was nearly identical to the others, featureless head, long open mouth. But this one was different. It had eyes, two shallow holes carved into the face, almost symmetrical, as if whoever had made it had learned to adapt, to mimic a human face more closely. The ranger didn't say anything at first, just picked it up, turned it over, and placed it in a sample bag. But later at the station, he asked for a transfer. Cited health reasons. He hasn't spoken publicly since. The Grayspine district was rezoned within the month. The loop, along with the surrounding 9 square miles, was permanently closed to all public access. No backcountry permits, no trail maintenance, no patrol assignments. Signs were posted, but kept vague. Unstable ground, dangerous terrain, wildlife activity. Nothing about Luke, nothing about the boy, nothing about the voice. Nate Arlo, Luke's brother, was never seen near the forest again. He declined all interviews, deleted every online post about his search, sold his truck, moved south, refused to speak with anyone connected to the investigation. But one firefighter, a man from the original containment crew, came forward quietly 6 months later. Not to the media, not to law enforcement, just to a retired ranger he trusted, who passed the story on without asking questions. He said it happened the morning of the burn, before ignition. He was walking the edge of the containment line, checking wind direction, when he saw movement beyond the tree line. A figure, tall, in camouflage, not hurrying, just standing still, watching the crew work. The firefighter waved, thinking it was a ranger. The figure didn't move. Then it smiled. The man said it wasn't the smile that unsettled him. It was the delay. Like the figure didn't know how to smile, not at first, and had to remember what a smile looked like. He turned to call someone. When he looked back, the figure was gone. No tracks, no movement, just the trees. He never told the crew. He didn't want to be taken off rotation, but after the fire, he stopped working in forest zones, requested a transfer to coastal management, said he'd rather fight erosion than face what he'd seen. When asked what it looked like, the man, the smile, he said this: "It looked like someone trying to be someone I knew." And when asked who, he paused, then said, "I think it was trying to be Luke." They closed the record after that, but some stories don't go quiet. Some just wait.